If you asked a Boeing aeronautical engineer in 1943 if a heavy bomber could fly across the English Channel on a single engine, they would look at the mathematics and tell you it was absolutely impossible. The physics simply did not allow it. You cannot keep 36,000 pounds of dead metal in the air with highly asymmetrical thrust. The plane would instantly roll over. It would enter an uncontrollable death spiral. It would tear its own wings off before it ever hit the freezing water below. But 25,000 feet above the brutal skies of Nazi Germany, the strict laws of mathematics stopped matching. In the high-altitude meat grinder of the Second World War, the impossible happened almost every single day. This is the story of a machine that took a beating that would have disintegrated any other aircraft in human history. And it is the terrifying, miraculous story of the freezing teenage boys who rode a burning piece of scrap metal across the ocean and simply refused to die. To understand the absolute miracle of what happened on this specific mission, you first have to understand the nightmare these men were flying into. In 1943, the air war over Europe was not fought in the mud and the dirt of the trenches. It was fought in a freezing, alien environment 5 miles above the earth. The British Royal Air Force had already tried bombing Germany in the daylight. They stopped because it was pure suicide. The German Luftwaffe was the most experienced and lethal air force on the planet. They slaughtered the British bombers without mercy. The Royal Air Force decided it was only safe to bomb at night, hiding their planes in the darkness. But the United States Army Air Forces had a very different idea. They believed in a highly dangerous military doctrine called daylight precision bombing. The American generals believed that if you could actually see the target, a ball-bearing factory, a synthetic oil refinery, or a concrete submarine pen, you could drop a high-explosive bomb right down its smokestack and completely cripple the German war machine. It was a brilliant strategic idea, but it came with a terrifying catch. If you fly a massive, slow-moving bomber in the middle of the day, the enemy can see you coming from 100 miles away. The American bombers would be flying deep into heavily defended enemy territory in broad daylight. They would be sitting ducks for the radar-guided German anti-aircraft guns and the deadly Messerschmitt fighter planes. To survive this suicide mission, the Americans needed a very specific kind of weapon. They did not just need an airplane. They needed a flying tank. And the engineers at the Boeing Aircraft Company delivered a mechanical masterpiece. The B-17 Flying Fortress. Just looking at it sitting on the concrete tarmac, it was a monster of a machine. It was 74 feet long. It had a massive wingspan of over 100 feet. It was powered by 4 terrifyingly loud Wright Cyclone radial engines. Each of those massive 9-cylinder engines produced 1,200 horsepower. When all 4 engines were running at maximum revolutions per minute, the roar was so deafening that the ground crew had to communicate entirely with hand signals. The vibration would physically shake the teeth in your skull. But the true genius of the B-17 was not its massive engines. It was its bones. The plane was designed with an internal skeleton of thick aluminum bulkheads and heavy structural webbing. Boeing built the plane with a highly advanced concept called extreme redundancy. In a normal airplane, if a machine gun bullet severs the steel cable that connects the pilot's control stick to the tail rudder, the pilot instantly loses control and the plane crashes into the earth. In the B-17, if a bullet severed the primary control cable, there was a secondary cable routed right next to it. If that secondary cable was severed by hot shrapnel, there was a third. The plane was over-engineered to an almost absurd degree. There are highly documented historical cases of flying fortresses coming home with their tail sections completely chewed off by cannon fire. There are official military photographs of bombers flying with their wings folded upward, and with massive, gaping holes in the fuselage so large you could drive an army jeep straight through them. The plane simply refused to fall out of the sky. It was designed to absorb horrific punishment and keep flying. And then there was the armor and the weaponry. The reason the American press immediately called it the Flying Fortress was because it absolutely bristled with heavy guns. It carried 13 .50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns. There were guns mounted in the clear plexiglass nose. There were guns pointing out the open side windows, manned by the waist gunners standing directly in the freezing wind. There was a gunner sitting in an armored box at the very tail of the plane. And underneath the belly of the beast was the most terrifying and claustrophobic position of all, the Sperry ball turret. It was a perfectly round glass and metal sphere hanging underneath the plane, suspended over nothing but empty air. The gunner who sat inside it had to be a very small man. He was folded into a tight fetal position, his knees pressed hard against his chest, staring straight down at the earth through a thin sheet of plexiglass directly between his heavy boots. If the bomber's landing gear failed and the plane had to crash land, the ball turret gunner would be the very first man crushed against the concrete runway. But when hundreds of these heavily armed flying fortresses flew together in a tight, overlapping defensive formation called a combat box, they created a massive dome of 50 caliber lead that was almost impenetrable to enemy fighters. It was a marvel of human engineering and lethal defense. But inside this massive, heavy, deafening machine were the softest and most fragile components of all: the human crew. A standard B-17 crew was made up of 10 men. The pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, the bombardier, the flight engineer, the radio operator, and 4 dedicated gunners. If you looked at a photograph of a heavy bomber crew standing on the tarmac before a mission, the very first thing you would notice is their faces. They were not hardened, grizzled military veterans. They were kids. They were farm boys from Iowa. They were auto mechanics from Brooklyn. They were factory workers from Ohio. The average age of a heavy bomber crewman in the 8th Air Force was just 20 years old. Many of them were still teenagers, thousands of miles away from their homes. And they were fighting in the most hostile environment on planet Earth. When a B-17 bomber climbed to its standard bombing altitude of 25,000 feet, it left the human world far behind. The cabin of the bomber was completely unpressurized. That meant the air inside the thin aluminum tube was the exact same as the freezing, deadly air outside. At 5 miles up into the atmosphere, there is barely enough oxygen to keep a human being conscious. If a crewman's rubber oxygen mask froze solid, or if the air hose became accidentally disconnected during a chaotic firefight, he would pass out from hypoxia in less than 60 seconds. 3 minutes later, his brain would shut down and he would die. And then there was the cold. The temperature inside the uninsulated fuselage of the bomber regularly dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cold so absolute and so violent that it felt like a physical attack on the human body. If a waist gunner took off his heavy leather glove for just 1 single second to clear a jammed 50 caliber machine gun, and his bare skin touched the frozen aluminum wall of the plane, the moisture in his skin would instantly weld to the metal. When he pulled his hand away in a panic, the flesh would tear right off his fingers. To survive this freezing hell, the men wore heavy, electrically heated blue flight suits. They were plugged directly into the bomber's power grid, designed to act like human toasters. But the suits were notoriously unreliable. Sometimes the wires short-circuited in the intense cold, leaving the young men to suffer severe frostbite that would turn their toes and fingers black before they ever reached the target. Sometimes the suits overheated and caught fire, burning the men alive while they were desperately trying to fight off swarms of German fighter planes. The noise inside the fuselage was absolutely deafening. The men could not hear each other scream. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel, leaking hydraulic fluid, vomit from violent airsickness, and the sharp, metallic scent of burned gunpowder filled the freezing air. It was an 8-hour sentence in a vibrating, terrifying tin can. The Boeing engineers had successfully built the ultimate machine of war. They had built an absolute fortress. But on one specific morning, deep over the skies of hostile Europe, the limits of that incredible machine and the psychological limits of the 10 terrified kids sitting inside it were about to be pushed far past the breaking point. The order was given from high command. The target was drawn on the map with a bright red line. The flying fortresses were going into the meat grinder, and absolutely everyone in the briefing room knew that not all of them were coming back. 3 o'clock in the morning. The English countryside is pitch black. The grass is covered in a thick, freezing layer of white frost. It is dead quiet, and then the heavy wooden door of the Nissen hut is kicked wide open. A harsh, blinding flashlight sweeps across the rows of sleeping teenagers. A corporal from the orderly room walks down the narrow center aisle, shouting into the cold darkness. He tells them to wake up. Breakfast is in 20 minutes. The combat briefing begins in 40 minutes. For the 10 men of the B-17 bomber crew, this is the exact moment the terror physically begins. They roll out of their heavy woolen blankets. Nobody speaks a single word. Their stomachs are tied in violently tight knots. They pull on their long thermal underwear. They lace up their heavy, fleece-lined flying boots and walk silently through the freezing mud toward the mess hall. This morning, the military cooks are serving fresh eggs and real bacon. In wartime England, where absolutely everything is strictly rationed and heavily controlled, this is an incredible luxury. But the young American flyers look at their metal plates with absolute dread. In the heavy bomber groups of the 8th Air Force, fresh eggs mean only one thing. It is the condemned man's breakfast. It means the target today is extremely deep inside enemy territory. It means the target is heavily defended. It means that a lot of the young boys eating this bacon are not coming home for dinner. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, they walk into the combat briefing room. The large room smells heavily of stale cigarette smoke, nervous sweat, and wet wool. Hundreds of young men sit shoulder to shoulder on hard wooden benches. The room is buzzing with a low, highly anxious murmur. At the very front of the room is a massive map of Europe, but it is entirely covered by a heavy black curtain. The commanding officer walks onto the wooden stage. The room snaps to absolute silence. You could hear a pin drop on the wooden floor. The officer reaches out, grabs the edge of the black curtain, and pulls it back. A collective groan echoes through the entire room. Stretching across the massive map, starting from their home base in England, crossing the icy English Channel, and stabbing incredibly deep into the black heart of Nazi Germany, is a bright red piece of yarn. The red yarn ends at the city of Bremen. Bremen is one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in the entire Third Reich. It is the home of the Focke-Wulf fighter aircraft factories and the deadly German submarine pens. It is surrounded by hundreds of radar-guided anti-aircraft guns. The intelligence officer steps up to the wooden podium. He looks at the terrified teenagers in the crowd. He tells them their primary target today is the Focke-Wulf assembly plant. He tells them they will be flying at 25,000 feet. The temperature over the target will drop to minus 65 degrees. Flak will be intensely heavy. They should expect heavy fighter opposition from the enemy coast all the way to the target and all the way back. The men stare blankly at the red line on the map. It is a 4-hour flight just to get there. 4 hours of flying straight through absolute hell. They synchronize their heavy mechanical watches. They grab their heavy parachute harnesses, their bright yellow Mae West life preservers, and their freezing rubber oxygen masks. They climb into the back of a canvas-covered army jeep and ride out into the absolute darkness of the airfield. And there, waiting quietly for them in the freezing English fog, is their ship, the B-17 Flying Fortress. The ground crews have been working all night in the freezing cold. The massive bomber is fully loaded and ready for war. Its belly is crammed with 6,000 pounds of high-explosive aerial bombs. Its fuel tanks are topped off with 2,700 gallons of highly volatile, high-octane aviation gas. Its ammunition cans are loaded with over 6,000 rounds of 50-caliber armor-piercing bullets. It is a massive, flying powder keg. The 10 young men climb through the small aluminum hatch near the front of the plane. They take their assigned combat stations. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot begin their incredibly long mechanical checklist. Engine number 1 prime. The pilot engages the electric starter. The massive Wright Cyclone engine coughs violently. It spits a giant cloud of thick blue smoke into the freezing air. And then it finally catches. The massive steel propeller blurs into a deadly, invisible arc. The engine roars with a deep, guttural, mechanical thunder. They start engine number 2, then engine number 3, then engine number 4. The noise is absolutely deafening. The entire 36,000-pound aluminum airframe vibrates violently against the concrete runway. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the pilot pushes the 4 heavy throttles forward. Taking off in a fully loaded B-17 is a terrifying exercise in brutal physics. The plane is so incredibly heavy that it takes up every single inch of the long runway just to get airborne. If a single engine fails during this critical takeoff roll, the heavily laden bomber will plummet straight into the English trees and vaporize in a 2,000-gallon fireball. But the engines hold their maximum power. The massive rubber tires finally leave the concrete. They are airborne. Now comes the absolute hardest physical challenge of the entire mission. The climb. They cannot just point the nose east and fly straight to Germany. A single heavy bomber would be slaughtered by German fighters in a matter of minutes. They have to form up into a massive, heavily defensive formation called the combat box. It takes over 2 hours of flying in tight, highly dangerous circles over England for hundreds of bombers to find each other in the thick morning clouds and assemble the massive armada. They are flying wingtip to wingtip, sometimes only 10 feet apart in the blinding white fog. Mid-air collisions happen almost every single week, killing entire crews before they ever see the enemy. As they assemble the combat box, they begin the grueling, slow climb to 25,000 feet. The higher they go, the more the physical torture begins. At 10,000 feet, the pilot comes over the crackling intercom. He orders everyone to put their oxygen masks on. For the next 7 hours, the crew will breathe pure, bone-dry oxygen. Every single breath smells heavily like dry rubber and cold metal. At 15,000 feet, the temperature quickly drops below zero. At 20,000 feet, it hits -40. Thick white ice begins to form on the inside of the plexiglass windows. The waist gunners, standing by the open side windows of the bomber, are being blasted directly in the face by a 200-mile-per-hour freezing hurricane. At 25,000 feet, they finally cross the rugged coastline of Europe. They are now officially in hostile enemy territory. The German radar operators down below have been watching them on their glowing screens for hours. They know exactly how many American bombers are coming. They know their exact altitude, and they know their exact speed. The German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground, manning the deadly 88mm cannons, begin to violently dial in their mathematical coordinates. Inside the B-17, the crew is sitting in absolute terrifying silence. The internal intercom is completely quiet. Every man is staring out into the bright, freezing blue sky, waiting for the inevitable, and then the navigator sees it. He presses his intercom button. Flak, 12 o'clock, level, directly ahead of the massive bomber formation. The clear blue sky suddenly erupts into a massive, terrifying field of black clouds. It is a heavy anti-aircraft barrage, a literal wall of exploding steel that the American bombers have to fly straight through. When you watch old Hollywood movies, flak looks like harmless little puffs of dark smoke. But to the terrified men sitting inside the thin aluminum bomber, it was the most terrifying thing on Earth. An 88mm flak shell does not have to hit the plane directly to kill it. The heavy shell is designed with a mechanical time fuse to explode at a very specific altitude, sending thousands of jagged, razor-sharp pieces of superheated shrapnel ripping through the thin air at supersonic speeds. As the B-17 enters the dark flak field, the crew can physically hear it. Over the deafening roar of their four massive engines, they hear a deep, heavy, concussive thud. It sounds like someone beating a massive bass drum right next to their heads. That is the sound of the heavy artillery shells detonating outside the plane. And then the hot shrapnel actually hits the plane. It sounds exactly like a giant handful of heavy gravel being violently thrown against a cheap tin roof. Ping, ping, crack. The entire bomber bucks wildly in the sky. The massive shockwaves from the close explosions toss the 36,000-pound aircraft around like a cheap paper toy. The two young pilots wrestle violently with the heavy steel control columns, fighting with absolutely all their physical strength just to keep the massive wings level. The harsh, sulfuric smell of raw German explosives instantly floods the cabin. Black puffs of smoke are exploding violently on the left wing. On the right wing, directly above the glass cockpit, the young men in the back of the plane have absolutely no control over their own fate. They just sit there, gripping the cold steel of their heavy machine guns, staring blindly at the black explosions, praying to God that the next artillery shell does not have their name written on it. And then their luck finally runs out. A German 88mm shell detonates incredibly close, less than 30 feet from their left wing. The violent explosion is absolutely blinding. A deafening, metallic crack shatters the freezing air. The B-17 violently rolls to the right side. The co-pilot slams both of his heavy boots onto the left rudder pedals to stop the plane from flipping over entirely and entering a fatal death spiral. Jagged, red-hot shrapnel violently shreds the thin aluminum skin of the left wing. The top turret gunner screams over the chaotic intercom. Engine number 1 is hit. The pilot looks quickly out his small side window. Engine number 1, the outboard engine on the far left wing, has been catastrophically damaged by the blast. The hot shrapnel has completely severed the main oil lines. Thick, blinding black smoke is pouring heavily out of the metal engine cowling. The pilot immediately checks his main instrument panel. The oil pressure gauge for engine number 1 is rapidly dropping to absolute zero. The cylinder head temperatures are violently spiking into the dangerous red zone. The massive engine is vibrating so violently that the entire left wing is visibly shaking up and down. If a massive radial engine runs without lubricating oil, the intense friction will generate so much heat that the internal metal components will actually melt together. The engine will seize abruptly, and the immense, violent torque of the massive spinning propeller will physically tear the entire engine right off the wing. The pilot screams his order. Shut it down. Feather number 1. The co-pilot reaches up quickly and frantically pulls the red fire switch. He cuts the raw fuel mixture to the dying engine. But he has to do one more incredibly crucial thing. He hits the electric feathering button. This mechanical action changes the pitch of the massive aluminum propeller blades. It turns the thin, sharp edge of the blades directly into the heavy wind, completely stopping them from catching the rushing air. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive metal propeller on the far left wing stops spinning entirely. It freezes in place, perfectly still against the freezing blue sky. The violent, terrifying shaking finally stops. The engine is completely dead. The crew breathes a massive, momentary sigh of relief. The wing did not snap off. The plane did not explode into a fireball. But their relief lasts for exactly 3 seconds. Because now they are in terrible, lethal danger. They are carrying thousands of pounds of heavy bombs. They are carrying thousands of gallons of explosive gas. And they have just lost exactly 25% of their engine power. The desperate pilot pushes the throttles of the 3 remaining engines all the way forward, trying desperately to maintain their cruising speed. But it is basic, brutal physics. A heavily loaded bomber flying on only 3 engines simply cannot keep up with a massive formation flying on 4. Slowly, inch by terrifying inch, the crippled B-17 begins to fall behind the main combat box. They are dropping back. They are losing the highly protective dome of the heavy 50 caliber machine guns. They are officially becoming a straggler. And in the freezing skies over Nazi Germany, the Luftwaffe pilots have a very specific, lethal hunting strategy. They do not attack the heavily defended center of the massive bomber formation. They wait patiently in the high clouds. They look specifically for the stragglers. They look for the wounded and the dying. Outside the plane, the violent flak barrage suddenly stops. The black clouds of smoke quickly fade away. The sky is suddenly crystal clear and incredibly quiet. The tail gunner grips his heavy machine gun tightly. His hands are sweating profusely inside his freezing leather gloves. He knows exactly what the sudden silence means. The anti-aircraft guns on the ground have purposefully stopped firing, so they do not accidentally hit their own planes. The German fighters are finally here. The absolute slaughter is about to begin. The absolute silence in the freezing air is more terrifying than the explosions. When the heavy anti-aircraft flak suddenly stops, the 10 men inside the crippled B-17 bomber know exactly what is coming. They know they are bleeding. They have lost engine number 1. They are rapidly falling behind the protective dome of the combat box. They are alone in the sky over Germany. The tail gunner is kneeling in his cramped armored box at the very back of the plane. He is staring out into the freezing blue horizon. His hands are gripping the twin wooden handles of his 50 caliber machine guns so tightly that his knuckles are completely white beneath his heavy leather gloves. He squints through the thick plexiglass. Far off in the distance, tiny black dots begin to appear. At first, they look like a harmless swarm of insects hovering against the white clouds. But they are moving incredibly fast. The black dots are growing larger by the second. The tail gunner presses his intercom button. Fighters, 6 o'clock. Coming in fast. The German Luftwaffe has arrived. Swarms of Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 single-engine fighter planes are circling the wounded bomber like sharks smelling blood in the water. The German pilots are elite veterans. They see the thick trail of black smoke pouring from the dead engine on the B-17. They know the American bomber is a straggler. They know it is highly vulnerable. But the German pilots do not attack from the rear. Early in the war, the Luftwaffe discovered a highly fatal flaw in the design of the Flying Fortress. If a fighter plane attacked from behind, they had to fly through a massive storm of defensive fire from the tail gunner, the waist gunners, the ball turret, and the top turret. It was suicide. Instead, the German pilots developed a terrifying new tactic. They attacked head-on. The pilot and co-pilot of the B-17 look directly out their front windshield. 3 Focke-Wulf 190s are diving straight toward the nose of their bomber from 12 o'clock high. The physics of a head-on attack are absolutely terrifying. The American bomber is flying forward at 200 miles per hour. The German fighters are diving directly at them at 400 miles per hour. That creates a combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour. The two young American pilots have exactly 3 seconds to react. But there is absolutely nothing they can do. They cannot turn a massive heavy bomber fast enough to dodge. They just have to sit in their seats, grip the control columns, and watch the enemy planes fly straight at their faces. The noses of the German fighters suddenly flash with bright yellow light. They are firing 20mm explosive cannon shells. A standard 50 caliber machine gun bullet simply punches a clean hole through aluminum. But a 20mm cannon shell is designed to hit the metal and violently detonate, blowing massive, jagged holes into the aircraft structure. The front of the B-17 erupts in absolute chaos. The sound of the explosive shells hitting the fuselage is deafening. It sounds like someone is violently swinging a heavy sledgehammer against the outside of the aluminum cabin. The heavy plexiglass nose of the bomber is instantly shattered. Freezing, 200-mile-per-hour wind violently blasts into the cockpit. The navigator and the bombardier, sitting in the front nose compartment, are completely surrounded by flying glass and razor-sharp metal shrapnel. The top turret gunner begins firing his twin 50 caliber machine guns wildly at the blurring shapes of the German fighters as they scream directly over the top of the cockpit. The noise is highly disorienting. The smell of raw explosive powder completely chokes the freezing air. The B-17 violently shudders. It has taken massive structural damage. In the back of the plane, the intercom comes alive with terrified screaming. The tail gunner has taken hot shrapnel to his leg. He is bleeding heavily, but he refuses to leave his guns. A 20mm cannon shell has ripped a massive hole completely through the right side of the waist compartment. The explosive blast has totally severed the main oxygen lines for the gunners in the back. If they do not get oxygen immediately, they will pass out and die in minutes. The young men frantically unclip their masks from the wall and plug them into small, portable green walk-around oxygen bottles. They are operating on pure, terrifying adrenaline. But the nightmare is just beginning. The German fighters pull up into the clouds and circle back around for a second pass. They know the bomber is badly hurt. They want to finish the job. This time, a Messerschmitt 109 dives aggressively from the right side. The waist gunner fires desperately, tracing his bright red tracer bullets across the sky, but the German fighter is simply too fast. The Messerschmitt fires a long, brutal burst from its nose cannons. The American co-pilot looks out the right window. Engine number 3 takes a direct, catastrophic hit. The heavy 20mm shell punches straight through the metal engine cowling and detonates directly inside the highly pressurized cylinders. A massive, blinding ball of orange fire instantly erupts from the right wing. Flames are aggressively licking the thin aluminum skin of the wing, pulling violently backward in the heavy wind. If the intense fire reaches the main fuel tanks hidden directly inside the wing structure, the entire plane will vaporize in a highly explosive fireball. The pilot screams over the noise. Fire in engine 3. Hit the extinguisher. The co-pilot desperately smashes his hand against the internal fire suppression system. He cuts the raw fuel lines to the right wing. A thick cloud of white chemical foam violently blasts into the burning engine compartment. The men hold their breath, watching the flames. Slowly, The bright orange fire dies out. The wing does not explode. But engine number 3 is completely dead. A massive trail of thick white smoke is now pouring out of the right wing. The situation has just gone from highly desperate to mathematically impossible. The B-17 is now flying with only 2 working engines. They have lost exactly 50% of their total power. The massive bomber immediately begins to rapidly lose altitude. The pilot and co-pilot are physically standing on the rudder pedals, fighting the heavy control yokes with their entire body weight just to keep the nose from violently dropping. They are sinking fast. 20,000 feet, 19,000 feet, 18,000 feet. They have fallen completely out of the sky. The massive combat box of American bombers is now miles ahead of them, disappearing into the white clouds. They are entirely alone. A crippled, bleeding beast falling slowly toward the hostile Earth. The German fighter pilots see the massive bomber dropping. They know it is the end. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 rolls over on its back and drops aggressively into a steep, lethal dive. It is coming in for the final kill. The American top turret gunner tracks the incoming fighter. He pulls his triggers, but his guns click empty. He is out of ammunition. The German pilot carefully lines up his crosshairs directly on the American bomber. He squeezes his firing trigger. A brutal, concentrated stream of explosive cannon fire aggressively rakes across the left wing of the B-17. The final, fatal blow strikes engine number 2. The massive engine does not catch fire. Instead, the heavy internal mechanics violently shatter. The violent impact destroys the main drive shaft. The engine physically seizes with a terrifying, metallic screech that can be heard entirely over the roaring wind. The co-pilot desperately reaches up to hit the feathering button, to turn the massive propeller blades into the wind and stop them from spinning. He hits the switch. Nothing happens. The electrical lines have been completely severed by the cannon fire. The massive aluminum propeller refuses to stop. It is aggressively windmilling in the rushing air. It is creating a massive, highly dangerous wall of aerodynamic drag. It is acting like a giant metal parachute tied directly to the left wing, violently pulling the heavy bomber out of the sky. The young American pilot stares blankly at his shattered instrument panel. The glass dials are cracked and covered in dark engine oil. Engine 1 is dead. Engine 2 is dead. Engine 3 is dead. Out of the 4 massive power plants designed to keep 36,000 pounds of solid metal in the freezing sky, only one single engine is still running. Engine number 4, the outboard engine on the far right wing. The pilot looks over at his 20-year-old co-pilot. Their faces are completely covered in freezing sweat and dry blood from the shattered windshield. According to every single engineering manual ever written by the Boeing Aircraft Company, they are already dead. A Flying Fortress simply cannot fly on one engine. But the pilot grips the heavy steel control yoke. He shoves the final throttle as far forward as it can possibly go. Engine number 4 begins to violently scream. The terrifying fight for the English Channel has officially begun. According to the brilliant aeronautical engineers who designed the Flying Fortress, a B-17 simply cannot fly on a single engine. It is a basic, unforgiving law of physics. When a massive heavy bomber loses 3 of its 4 power plants, it becomes a 36,000-pound glider made of solid aluminum. But the reality is actually much worse than simply gliding. Engine number 1 is dead. Engine number 2 is dead. Engine number 3 is dead. The only thing keeping 10 terrified young men from plunging into the freezing earth is engine number 4. It is located on the extreme far right side of the massive right wing. And this creates a highly lethal aerodynamic nightmare known as extreme asymmetrical thrust. Because the only working engine is pushing entirely from the far right side, the heavy plane violently wants to spin to the left. The massive, dead left wing is acting like a giant metal parachute, creating immense aerodynamic drag. If the pilots let go of the flight controls for even one single second, the Flying Fortress will instantly flip completely over on its back and enter an unrecoverable death spiral. To prevent this, the 20-year-old pilot and his co-pilot have to do something physically agonizing. They have to completely push the right rudder pedal down to the metal floorboard and hold it there with absolutely every single ounce of their combined physical strength. They are practically standing up in their seats. Their leg muscles are violently cramping. They are sweating profusely inside their heavy leather flight jackets, even though the air temperature inside the shattered cockpit is -40 degrees. They are physically wrestling a massive, dying beast, desperately trying to force it to fly straight. But despite their superhuman effort, the B-17 is rapidly losing altitude. They are dropping completely out of the high-altitude freezing zone. 15,000 feet, 14,000 feet, 13,000 feet. The air is slowly getting warmer and thicker, giving the massive wings a little more lift. But the ground is getting terrifyingly close. They are flying over the occupied coast of Europe, desperately trying to reach the open water of the English Channel. The pilot keys his intercom microphone. His voice is shaking, but his order is absolutely clear. He tells the crew they are too heavy. They are sinking fast. He orders them to throw absolutely everything out of the airplane. If it is not bolted to the airframe, it goes out the window. If it is bolted to the airframe, break it off and throw it out anyway. In the back of the freezing, shattered fuselage, the absolute stripping of the bomber begins. The waist gunners frantically grab their heavy 50 caliber Browning machine guns. Each of these massive weapons weighs 85 pounds. They violently rip them from their steel mounting brackets and shove them directly out the open side windows. They watch the heavy black guns tumble down into the white clouds below. Next, they grab the heavy wooden and metal ammunition boxes. Thousands of rounds of heavy brass bullets, weighing hundreds of pounds, are aggressively pushed out of the plane. The young men strip off their heavy, lead-lined steel flak jackets and throw them out. They throw out their heavy winter flying boots. They throw out their heavy leather jackets. In the front of the plane, the bombardier takes a heavy steel fire extinguisher and violently smashes the highly classified Norden bombsight into dozens of jagged pieces. He kicks the broken metal out of the shattered plexiglass nose. The radio operator rips his heavy communication radios completely out of the wall. He cuts the thick black electrical cables and throws the massive metal boxes out the open bomb bay doors. The heavy plane instantly feels the difference. It shudders, lifting slightly in the air as hundreds of pounds of dead weight are dumped into the sky. But it is not enough. The massive bomber is still slowly sinking toward the violent, gray waves of the English Channel. They are completely cut off from the outside world. They have no radios. They have no machine guns to defend themselves. If a single German fighter finds them now, they cannot even fire a single bullet back. They are a completely defenseless, bleeding target. They finally cross the rugged coastline of Europe. Directly below them is the freezing, dark gray water of the English Channel. It is the most dangerous stretch of water in the world. If the dying bomber hits those violent waves, it will shatter into 1,000 pieces of twisted aluminum. If by some absolute miracle any of the crew actually survive the violent crash, they will be floating in freezing water. The human body can only survive in the winter temperatures of the English Channel for exactly 4 minutes before severe hypothermia stops the heart. The men in the back of the plane look at each other in the freezing wind. They realize a terrifying truth. If they have to ditch the plane in the ocean, their parachutes are completely useless. A heavy silk parachute will only drag a drowning man straight to the bottom of the freezing sea. Furthermore, each parachute pack weighs exactly 20 pounds. For a crew of 10 men, that is 200 pounds of completely dead weight rapidly dragging the heavy bomber down toward the water. Without a single word being spoken, the young waist gunner reaches across his chest and unbuckles his heavy parachute harness. He slides the heavy canvas pack off his shoulders. He walks to the open side window, and he throws his only chance of individual survival directly into the ocean. One by one, every single man in the freezing plane does the exact same thing. They throw their parachutes out the windows. They are making the ultimate terrifying commitment to each other. They are not going to bail out. They are not going to abandon the ship. They are either going to make it back to the green grass of England together, or they are all going to die in the freezing gray water together. The B-17 is now flying at exactly 2,000 feet. They are so incredibly low that they can clearly see the whitecaps violently crashing on the dark waves below them. The heavy plane is literally skimming the top of the ocean. And on the far right wing, engine number 4 is experiencing absolute mechanical agony. The Wright Cyclone engine is a brilliant marvel of American engineering. But it was absolutely never designed to pull 36,000 pounds of metal completely by itself. It is running on pure, explosive aviation gas, but it is working far beyond its maximum mathematical limits. The engine block is violently shaking. Thick, hot black oil is continuously spitting out of the metal exhaust pipes, aggressively splattering against the aluminum wing. The internal temperature gauges on the pilot's instrument panel are completely pegged in the dangerous red zone. The massive engine is screaming. It sounds like a dying animal roaring in the freezing wind. The internal metal cylinders are expanding from the intense, superheated friction. It is literally shaking itself to pieces, could violently seize and explode at any given second. The young pilot stares through the shattered, blood-stained glass of his front windshield. His right leg is completely numb from standing on the heavy rudder pedal. His arms are violently shaking from wrestling the heavy control yoke. He gently pats the cold aluminum dashboard of the instrument panel with his freezing hand. He whispers quietly to the dying machine. He begs the screaming engine to just hold on for 20 more minutes. He begs the shattered metal wings to just keep catching the air. They are flying on nothing but sheer human willpower, a single screaming engine, and the absolute grace of God. Ahead of them, rising slowly out of the thick, dark ocean fog, the navigator finally sees it. A massive, towering wall of bright white chalk. The white cliffs of Dover. They have reached the coast of England. But the absolute most dangerous part of the entire mission is just about to begin. Because bringing a shattered, unsteerable heavy bomber down onto the ground without exploding requires a completely different kind of miracle. The massive, towering white cliffs of Dover rise slowly from the freezing gray water of the English Channel. When the 10 young men inside the shattered B-17 see that bright white chalk through the dark ocean fog, they feel a massive, overwhelming surge of pure hope. They have officially crossed the water. They have made it back to the green fields of England. But the 20-year-old pilot sitting in the freezing cockpit knows the terrifying truth. Getting back to England is only half of the battle. Now, he actually has to put 36,000 pounds of shattered, burning aluminum onto the solid ground without killing every single man inside. The pilot reaches down to the center console with his freezing, blood-stained hand. He grabs the heavy mechanical lever to lower the landing gear. He pulls it backward. Absolutely nothing happens. He frantically pumps the manual emergency handle, but the heavy metal lever is completely dead. The internal hydraulic fluid lines were completely severed by the German 20mm cannon shells high over Europe. The heavy hydraulic fluid has totally bled out into the freezing sky. The massive rubber tires are stuck tightly inside the metal engine nacelles. They have absolutely no brakes. They have no steering. They are going to have to perform a highly dangerous, high-speed belly landing. The pilot keys his intercom microphone for the very last time. He tells the crew to assume the crash positions. In the back of the freezing, windy fuselage, the waist gunners and the tail gunner quickly brace themselves against the heavy metal bulkheads. They violently interlock their arms and their legs. They bury their faces deep into their knees. They pray silently in the freezing wind. The crippled B-17 is flying at exactly 1,000 feet. The pilot spots a long, flat stretch of bright green English grass surrounded by thick trees. It is an emergency Royal Air Force landing strip. He aggressively wrestles the heavy steel control yoke, lining the shattered nose of the bomber directly up with the green field. At exactly 500 feet, the pilot makes the most terrifying decision of his entire life. He reaches out and violently pulls back the final, single throttle. He completely cuts the raw aviation fuel to engine number 4. The massive, overworked Wright Cyclone engine coughs heavily. It spits a final, dark cloud of black oil against the right wing, and suddenly dies. The massive metal propeller completely stops spinning. Suddenly, there is absolute terrifying silence. For the first time in 8 highly agonizing hours, the deafening, bone-rattling roar of the massive radial engines is completely gone. The only sound left in the world is the heavy wind rushing violently through the shattered plexiglass windows. The Flying Fortress is now officially a 36,000-pound glider. It drops rapidly toward the green earth. The young pilot pulls back on the heavy control yoke with absolutely all of his remaining physical strength, desperately trying to keep the heavy nose pointing up. And then they hit the ground. The physical impact is incredibly violent. The flat metal belly of the massive bomber slams directly into the hard English dirt at over 100 miles per hour. A deafening, horrific screech of aggressively tearing aluminum completely shatters the quiet countryside. A massive shower of brown dirt, green grass, and flying rocks blasts violently into the open side windows. The heavy plane violently bounces back into the air, slams hard back down onto the dirt, and aggressively slides across the wet grass. Bright orange sparks fly wildly as the metal belly violently grinds against the solid earth. For 10 agonizing seconds, the young men are thrown violently around the inside of the cabin like cheap rag dolls. And then, with a massive, bone-jarring jolt, the 36,000-pound beast comes to a dead, sudden stop. Absolute silence returns to the English countryside. A thick, choking cloud of brown dust and white smoke heavily surrounds the shattered airplane. The 10 young men inside are completely stunned. They are breathing heavily in the dark cabin. They are waiting for the massive fuel tanks to explode into a lethal fireball. The pilot violently kicks open his side window. He screams at the top of his lungs for everyone to get out immediately. The terrified crew frantically scrambles out of the top emergency escape hatches and the shattered side doors. They drop heavily onto the soft, wet green grass. They run exactly 50 yards away from the smoking wreckage, and they violently collapse onto the ground. They look around at each other in the clearing dust. They are alive. All 10 of them. Not a single man was killed. An English emergency ground crew quickly arrives in their army jeeps. The highly experienced mechanics jump out and simply stare at the massive bomber in absolute, stunned disbelief. They slowly walk around the shattered B-17. They begin to count the jagged bullet and cannon holes ripped through the thin aluminum skin. They completely stop counting at 500. The entire left wing is violently shredded like cheap tin foil. The massive tail section is miraculously hanging onto the fuselage by a single, incredibly thin strip of bent aluminum. Half of the vertical rudder is completely blown away into the sky. Engine number 2 and engine number 3 are violently shattered. The brilliant Boeing engineers back in Seattle had calculated that this specific amount of catastrophic structural damage was mathematically impossible to survive. The plane should have disintegrated at 25,000 feet. But the heavy metal bird had brought its boys home anyway. Today, history books and Hollywood movies often remember the sleek, incredibly fast fighter planes like the P-51 Mustang or the British Spitfire. We widely celebrate the glamorous knights of the sky who danced through the clouds. But for the tens of thousands of young American boys who fought and bled in the freezing, brutal meat grinder of the 8th Air Force, the true hero of the Second World War was a slow, heavy, deafening monster. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was originally designed as a highly brutal weapon of war. But in the freezing, lethal skies over Nazi Germany, it became something completely different. It became the ultimate, indestructible lifeboat. They officially called it a flying fortress. And on that incredibly cold morning in 1943, the fortress absolutely held the line.